It was supposed to be a fun little Christmas present. One of those spit-in-a-tube ancestry kits, the kind that tells you where your people came from a few hundred years back. I bought 4 of them, one for me, one for my wife, one for each of my 2 kids, as a stocking stuffer, a goof, something for us to laugh about around the table over the holidays. I never once imagined that a cardboard box with a plastic tube in it would be the thing that finally told me the truth about my own family. But that's how it came to me. Not from my wife's mouth, from a lab. I'm going to tell you the hardest thing first, so you understand what kind of story this is. My 10-year-old son, the boy I taught to ride a bike and to bait a hook, the boy who falls asleep on my shoulder, is not mine by blood. I found that out from a website on an ordinary Tuesday in January, 11 years into a lie. And what I did about it, what I decided that boy was to me once I knew, is the whole reason I'm telling you this. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me. I want to know who's out there with me. And stay to the end, because by the time I was done, I had answered a question most men never have to ask, which is whether a father is something you are in the blood or something you decide to be. And I want to hand you my answer. My name is Cal. I'm 46 years old, and I'm an ironworker in Michigan. I tie steel together, high up, the bones of buildings and bridges, and I've done it since I was a young man. I was married to Pam for 16 years. We have 2 kids, a daughter named Allie, who's 14, and a son named Mason, who's 10. I'm going to tell you how a cheap mail-order DNA kit blew the roof off my marriage, and how, standing in the rubble of it, I made the most important decision of my whole life about a boy who shares not one drop of my blood and is, to the bottom of my soul, my son. If you're new here, this channel is for the men nobody checks on, the ones who go to work, keep their word, carry the weight, and find out one ordinary day that the floor under their family was never as solid as they thought. I'm not a counselor, and I'm not going to sell you anything. I'm just a man who's been up high and come down hard, telling you the truth about how I got through it standing up, in case it helps you do the same. So, if a story like that is why you're here, do me the favor of subscribing, because there's a man out there tonight who needs to hear this. And the only way it reaches him is if folks like you help it travel. Let me start with the trust, because you can't understand what was broken until you understand what was built. I was a provider, the way the men who raised me were providers. Ironwork is hard, dangerous, and it follows the steel, which means it doesn't always stay close to home. There were years, especially when we were young and building everything from nothing, where I chased the big jobs wherever they were, out of state sometimes, gone for weeks at a stretch, living in a motel near a job site and sending the checks home. It's how a lot of ironworkers live. We call the ones who travel for work boomers, and for a good stretch I was one. Because the money on the big jobs is what built our house and filled our kids' college accounts. I told myself that was love. I told myself a man who'd hang off a beam 400 feet up in the Michigan wind to keep his family safe had earned a wife who'd keep the home fires burning while he was gone. And I want to be fair to her and to the truth, because there was an out-of-state job, a long one, about 11 years ago, where I was gone the better part of 3 months. And that I would come to understand much later is when the thing happened that I'm telling you about. I was up on the steel in another state, building somebody else's skyline, and my marriage was coming apart at home in a way I wouldn't learn about for over a decade. Pam and I started with about nothing, the way most real things start. I was a young journeyman with a union card and a beat-up truck, and she married me knowing she'd be marrying the road too, the long jobs, the weeks away. We built a good life out of it. We bought a brick ranch in a decent town, and we had Allie, and the years were good. And then, after that long out-of-state job, Pam told me she was pregnant again, and I was over the moon. And 9 months later there was Mason, and I held that boy in the hospital and I cried the way a man cries over his children, and not one cell in my body doubted he was mine. Why would it? He was my wife's baby, born into my marriage, into my arms. I named him after my grandfather. I have loved that boy with my whole chest every single day of his life. You have to understand what the work does to a marriage, because I think it's where the crack started, even if it doesn't excuse a thing. Ironwork is a brotherhood and a calling, but it's a jealous one. The steel goes up where the steel goes up, and you follow it or you don't feed your family. And in the building years, I followed it everywhere. I have helped raise skylines in cities I couldn't tell you 3 streets of. I have spent more nights than I can count in a hard motel bed with the wind howling, calling home to say goodnight to my kids through a phone while another man, it turns out, was a good deal closer to my house than I was. I was proud of the work. I was proud of being the kind of man who'd hang it all out over a beam to provide. And I never once did the math on what all those weeks away were costing me at home, because the checks were good and the house was nice, and I mistook a full bank account for a full marriage. They are not the same thing. I know that now. I paid a high tuition to learn it, and I want you to really hear what kind of father I was to Mason, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I taught that boy to ride his bike, running alongside him down our street until I let go and he flew. I taught him to bait a hook and to throw a ball and to look a man in the eye when he shakes his hand. I sat up with him through the croup and the nightmares. I coached his T-ball, a dugout full of 6-year-olds who couldn't find their own hats, and I loved every minute of it. He has a way of falling asleep against my side on the couch during a game, dead weight, trusting, the way only a kid who feels completely safe will do, and I have sat there with my arm gone numb for an hour rather than wake him. He calls me at work sometimes just to tell me something a 10-year-old thinks is the biggest news in the world, and I stop whatever I'm doing on whatever beam I'm on, and I listen. Because to that boy, I am the whole sky. That boy is stitched into me. Whatever a lab was about to tell me, it could not touch 10 years of that. I just didn't know yet that it was going to try. I'll tell you about the kits, because that's where it all came apart. It was the holidays, and I thought it'd be fun. We did them at the table on Christmas morning, everybody spitting in their little tubes and laughing about it, joking about how we were probably going to find out we were all secretly descended from kings. We mailed them off, and a few weeks went by, and then in January the results started coming in, one at a time, by email. I'd set up the accounts, because I'm the one who handles that kind of thing in our house, so the results came to me first. Mine came back about how I figured, the usual mix for a family like mine. Pam's came back, Ali's came back, and there it was, plain as day, my daughter, half her mother and half me. My people right there in her chart, and I felt that little glow a dad feels seeing himself in his kid. And then Mason's came back. I want to be careful telling this part, because it's the part that knocked me flat. Mason's results showed an ethnicity, a big slice of it, that neither Pam nor I have a single drop of. Not a trace. There was no way, looking at my chart and Pam's chart, for that to be in our boy, unless it came from somewhere else. And these websites, they do a thing now where they show you DNA relatives, other people who spit in a tube whose genes match yours. And on Mason's account, at the very top of the list, flagged as a close family relationship, closer than a cousin, was a man I had never heard of in my life. A man with a name I didn't know, living a couple hours away. I sat alone in that same kitchen where we'd all laughed on Christmas morning, and I looked at a stranger's name sitting where a father's name sits. And I understood, in a cold rush, that my whole life had a crack running through the middle of it that I'd never once seen. I didn't trust it at first. I told myself, these kits make mistakes. Samples get switched. The science isn't perfect. So I did the thing my trade taught me, which is that when the reading matters, you don't trust a cheap gauge. You verify with the good one. I did not go to a drugstore and buy a $5 test. I quietly, privately, took Mason and myself, a cheek swab from each of us on a day Pam thought we were just running errands, and I sent it to a real, accredited lab, the kind whose results hold up in a court, and I paid for the rush. And I waited the longest 2 weeks of my life. Those 2 weeks, I want to tell you, were a particular kind of torture, because I had to go on being dad the whole time. I made the lunches. I went to Mason's game and cheered like always, and he hit a little single and looked up into the stands to find me the way he always does, and I gave him the thumbs up. And inside, I was a man hanging over a void with the rope fraying, waiting on a letter to tell me whether the ground I'd stood on for 10 years was real. I'd lie awake at night next to a wife I now looked at like a stranger, doing the cruel arithmetic, counting back 11 years, lining up that long out-of-state job against Mason's birthday. And every time the numbers came out the same ugly way. By the time the envelope came, I think I already knew. But knowing in your gut and reading it on a page with a laboratory's letterhead are two different weights. And the page is heavier. The answer came back the way I already knew it would, with a number on it, a probability. And the probability that I was Mason's biological father was 0. Not low, 0. The boy I named after my grandfather was not, by blood, mine at all. I did not fall apart in front of my kids. I want you to know that. Because every single thing that came after depended on it. I sat with that paper alone, out in my garage, and I let myself break for one night where nobody could see. The kind of crying a grown man only does a few times in his life. And then I put it away, and I started to think, the way you think on the steel when something's gone wrong up high, and panic will get you killed. Slow, careful, one bolt at a time, because I had 2 children in that house who had done nothing, and whatever was broken between the adults, those kids were not going to be the ones who paid for it. Then I had to face Pam. I waited until the kids were at school, and I put the lab report on the table between us, and I watched her face. And her face told me everything before she said a word. She didn't ask what it was. She knew. She'd known for 11 years. The truth came out of her in pieces, the way these things do. The out-of-state job, the long one. The loneliness, she said. The same word I'd heard before. A man named Kyle. Somebody from before me, almost. Who'd come back around that spring while I was 4 states away on the steel. A few weeks of something that never should have happened. And then a pregnancy she couldn't be sure about. And a choice she made. In the hospital and every day for 11 years after, to let me believe, to let me name that boy after my grandfather, to let me love him as my own. Because the truth was too big and too late, and she'd convinced herself it was kinder this way. Kinder. She'd watched me raise another man's son for a decade, and called her silence kindness. I asked her the only questions that mattered to me. I asked if she'd ever planned to tell me, and she looked at the floor, and that was the answer. I asked if Mason knew, if she'd ever let it slip, and she said no, never. He had no idea, and that was the one thing she'd done right in 11 years, the one wall she'd kept up to protect the boy. And I hated that I was grateful to her for it. And I asked her how she could look at me across the supper table every single night for a decade. Watch me get up at 4 in the morning and drive to a job to provide for a son she knew wasn't mine, and never say a word. She didn't have an answer for that one. There isn't one. Some lies are so big the person telling them just builds a life on top of the lie, and learns to walk on the floor of it, and tries never to look down. She'd been walking on that floor for 11 years. I'd just fallen through it. I'm not going to tell you I stayed calm in that kitchen, because I didn't. Not all the way. But I never raised my hand and I never raised my voice past the point where a neighbor would have heard. Because the kid's world was hanging by a thread, and I was not going to be the one who cut it. What I felt, more than rage even, was a grief so big I could hardly stand under it. Not just for the marriage, which was over the second I read that report, but for every doctor's form I'd ever filled out wrong, every time I'd told Mason he had my grandfather's hands, every Father's Day card. All of it built on a thing she'd known and I hadn't. She let me be a father in the dark. I went to a lawyer that week, a sharp and kind woman named Denise, who'd done family law in our county a long time. And what she told me about Michigan law turned out to be the strangest mercy of my life. She told me about something called the presumption of paternity in Michigan. And in a lot of states, a child born to a married woman is presumed, in the eyes of the law, to be her husband's child. Legally, she said, you are Mason's father, not his stepfather, not a guardian, his father, full stop, with all the rights and all the duties, because he was born into your marriage and you have raised him as your own his whole life. And Michigan, she told me, takes that presumption seriously, more seriously than almost anywhere. And the courts here are very, very reluctant to let anybody blow up a child's family with a DNA test years down the line if a man has been that child's father all along. The biology, she said, does not automatically win. The relationship can win. The boy's actual life, the only father he's ever known, that can win. I remember sitting in that office, not quite believing her, because everything in the air these days tells you that DNA is the final word, that a paternity test settles everything, that blood is the truth and the rest is just sentiment. And here was a lawyer telling me the law sees it almost backward, that the law had looked at this exact heartbreak many times over the years and decided that a piece of paper from a lab does not get to walk into a 10-year-old's life and tell him the man who raised him is a stranger. She told me about cases, men who'd been fathers for years, where the courts had held the line and kept the family intact against the biology. Because a child's stability, a child's actual lived bond with the only parent he knows, was judged to matter more than a percentage. I sat there and felt, for the first time since Christmas, something other than the floor falling. I felt the law, of all things, reaching out a hand and saying, the thing you're afraid you've lost. You may not have lost it at all. It's still yours if you want it. And then she told me the part I'd been most afraid of. And it cut both ways. The biological father, this Kyle, if he ever found out and wanted to make a claim, it would be an uphill fight for him, a steep one, against the presumption and against everything that was best for Mason. But she also told me, gently, that the same presumption that protected me meant something I had to sit with. It meant the law would consider me Mason's father, whether I wanted to be or not. That if I divorced Pam, I could very well be ordered to support Mason, to keep being his dad in every legal way, because I was his dad in every real way. And she looked at me, and she asked the question that was really the only question in the whole case. She asked, Cal, do you want to be his father, or don't you? Because the law mostly thinks you are. The rest is up to your heart. I asked her what would happen to Mason if I walked away, if I fought to undo the presumption and cut him loose. Because I'm an honest man, and I'll admit to you the thought was in my head those first black days. And what she described was the thing that finally settled it. She said, Cal, that boy has a father, you, and a home, yours. And if you tear that up, he doesn't get handed a better one. He gets handed nothing. A biological stranger who's never met him, and a mother whose life just came apart. You wouldn't be giving him to his real father. You'd be taking the only father he's got and giving him a hole. She didn't say it to guilt me. She said it because I asked. And it was the truth. And the truth has a way of standing there in the room, not caring how much you wish it were different. I want to tell you about the days I sat with that question, because they were the hardest days of all of it, harder even than the kitchen, and because I think the answer is the only thing in this whole story worth keeping, because the poison comes for you, in that spot. It comes in a quiet, reasonable voice, and it says, "He's not yours." It says, "You've been robbed of a decade. You've been made a fool of. Why would you sign up to keep raising another man's son? To pay for him? To pour the rest of your life into a boy who came from the very betrayal that ended your marriage? Walk away from the boy too. Let Kyle have him. Let Pam deal with what she made. Nobody would blame you." That voice is loud, and it sounds like justice. And for a few days it had me. Because I was so hurt and so angry that hurting back felt like the only thing that would let me breathe. I lay in a bed in a spare room those nights and I let the voice talk. And it made a lot of sense, the way poison does. Every word it said was technically true. He wasn't mine by blood. I had been robbed. It would be easier. And all of it was true. And all of it was a lie at the same time, because it was measuring the wrong thing. It was measuring blood. And blood was never what made me that boy's father. And then one evening I came home from the lawyer's, and I was sitting in my truck in the driveway, not ready to go in. And through the front window, I could see Mason at the kitchen counter doing his homework. 10 years old, tongue stuck out the corner of his mouth, the way he does when he's concentrating. The exact way I do it, a thing he learned from watching me, not from any blood. And he looked up and saw my truck, and his whole face lit up, the way it has lit up for me 10,000 times. And he came barreling out the front door in his socks in the Michigan cold, yelling, "Dad, you're home!" And he threw himself at me the second I opened that truck door. And I caught my son, because that's what he is. I caught my son. And I held on to him in that cold driveway. And every lie in that voice that told me to walk away just went silent. Because there is no version of the truth where that boy running across the yard, yelling for his dad, is not mine. Blood didn't teach him to stick his tongue out when he concentrates. I did. Blood didn't run alongside his bike. I did. A man named Kyle made him, but I am his father. And I made that boy who he is. Just as surely as I tie the steel that holds a building up. One day, one connection, one ordinary act of showing up at a time. I want every man listening to sit in that driveway with me for a second. Because I think the whole thing turns right there. The lawyer's question, do you want to be his father or don't you, was never going to be answered in a lab report or a law book. It was answered by a 10-year-old with his tongue stuck out doing long division at the counter, and by the sound of his feet on the porch when he heard my truck. The paper could only tell me about the past. Only I could decide the future. And the future was that boy. And the boy was already mine, had been mine for 10 years, was mine before I ever pulled up that driveway. The deciding wasn't really a decision at all. It was just me finally catching up to a thing my heart had settled. A decade before a website ever tried to argue with it. So I decided. And once I decided, it was the easiest hard thing I've ever done. I divorced Pam, because what she did to me over 11 years was not something a marriage survives. And I won't pretend the divorce was painless, but it was clean, and it was right. And being free of the lie was its own kind of air after 11 years of breathing it without knowing. But I did not divorce my son. I told my lawyer that whatever the law said I was, I wanted to be more. That I wanted full standing, full custody, full everything. That Mason was mine and was staying mine. And because of that presumption, because I'd been his father every day of his life, because every teacher and doctor and neighbor and coach in that boy's world knew exactly whose son he was, the court agreed. Mason stayed with me, primarily in the only home he'd ever known, with the only father he'd ever known. Allie, too, my daughter, my blood, who I love no more and no less than her brother, which is the whole point. The two of them, together, with me. I have to tell you about Allie, my 14-year-old, because she taught me something in the middle of all this that I didn't expect. Teenagers see more than we give them credit for, and she knew something was wrong in the house even though I never told her what. One night, a few weeks into it. She found me out in the garage where I do my sitting and thinking. And she sat down next to me on the cold concrete, and she didn't say anything for a while. And then she said, "Dad, whatever's going on, Mason's scared. He can tell something's wrong even if he doesn't know what." And I looked at my daughter, 14 years old, worried about her little brother in the middle of her own parents falling apart. And I thought, this is what a family actually is. It's not the blood chart on a website. It's this. It's a kid watching out for her brother. So I went inside that night, and I sat on the edge of Mason's bed, and I told him that no matter what changed, no matter what he heard or felt in the house, that I was his dad, and I would be his dad every single day for the rest of his life, and nothing on this earth was ever going to change that. And he said, "Okay, Dad," kind of sleepy and sure, like I'd told him the sky was blue, like it had never once occurred to him to doubt it. And it never had. That's the gift I got to protect. Kyle, the biological father, when it all shook out, did not come for him. I don't know the whole of his reasons, and I don't much care. But a man who'd had no interest in a son for 11 years did not suddenly find it when there was nothing in it for him but child support and an uphill court fight against a boy's whole life. He stayed gone, which is the one decent thing he did in this story, and which left Mason's world exactly as it had always been, with me at the center of it. And Mason, to this day, does not know. He is 12 now, and he is happy and he is whole. And what happened between the grown-ups before he was born is not his weight to carry. Maybe someday, when he's a grown man strong enough to hold it, I'll tell him the truth. That he was the most chosen son a boy could be. That his dad found out and didn't blink. But that's a gift for a man, not a wound for a boy. And I'll know the difference when the day comes. And Pam, you ask, what about justice for what she did? I'll tell you the truth, that I didn't have to lift a finger for it. The lie was the punishment. She spent 11 years protecting a secret, and in the end, the secret cost her the marriage, the family, the man who'd have walked through fire for her, and the daily life of the children she has to share now, from the outside of a home she used to be the heart of. I never said an ugly word about her to those kids, not once, and I never will, because they need a mother. But she knows what she did, and she has to live in the smaller, lonelier life it built her. And I promise you, there is no revenge I could have cooked up that would weigh more than that. I didn't need to make her pay. The lie sent its own bill. There were men in my life, when word got around the way it does, who wanted me to make her pay anyway. Make her suffer, they said. Drag it out. Hit her where it hurts. And I understood the impulse, I did. But I'd already figured out something those well-meaning men hadn't. A man who spends his energy trying to destroy the person who hurt him is a man who's still letting that person run his life, just from the other direction. The day I stopped thinking about how to make Pam hurt and started thinking only about how to keep Mason whole was the day I actually got free of her. Revenge keeps you tied to the very person you're trying to get away from. Walking away clean cuts the line. I cut the line. I won't pretend I came through it without scars, and I'll own my peace, because a man always has one. I was gone too much. I chased the steel all over the country and told myself the money was the love, and I left a young wife alone too many weeks in too many years. And somewhere in that loneliness she made a terrible choice. Her choice was hers, and the 11-year lie was a cruelty all her own that I'll never excuse. But I wasn't home, and a man who's honest about a thing like this has to say that part too. Because the man who blames everything on the other person learns nothing and breaks the same way twice. So here's what a tired ironworker would tell you tonight, for whatever it's worth. People think a building stands up because of the steel. It doesn't. I've spent my life up on the iron, and I can tell you the steel is just the raw material. What holds a building up is the connections. The thousand places where one piece is tied to another, bolted and welded and made one. The joints you can't even see from the street. A beam by itself is nothing. It's the connecting that makes it strong. You can have the finest, strongest steel ever milled, and if it isn't connected to anything, it's just a heavy thing lying in the dirt. And a father is the same. Blood is just the raw material. It's the connecting that makes you a dad. The 10,000 ordinary joints, the bike and the hook and the homework and the sleeping kid on your numb arm. Every one a place where you tied your life to his until you couldn't be pulled apart. A man named Kyle gave my son his steel. I built the building, and there is not a force on this earth, not a lab, not a lie, not a court, that can take down a structure that's been connected right, one true joint at a time, for 10 solid years. The website measured the steel. It couldn't even see the building. I've still got my tools and my union card. And I still tie steel, though I take the closer jobs now and sleep in my own bed. Because I learned the hard way what the road can cost a man. My daughter's strong, and my son sticks his tongue out when he concentrates, just like his old man. And they are both equally, completely mine. The house has one less grown up in it, and a lot more peace. A while back, Mason came to me with a school project, one of those family tree assignments they hand out. And for 1 second, my heart stopped, because I thought, here it comes. Here's where the past walks in the door. And then I watched that boy draw a little box for me at the top and write Dad in it, in his careful 10-year-old letters, and connect it down to his box with a straight, proud line. And I realized the only family tree that boy has ever known or will ever need is the one with me at the top of it. I helped him with his project. We put my grandfather on there, the one he's named for. Blood would tell you that's a stranger to him. The tree Mason drew tells you the truth. And I'll take the tree the boy drew over the chart the website made every single day of my life. Tell me where you're standing when you hear this. And tell me, if a piece of paper told you the child you'd raised wasn't yours by blood, would you have caught him when he came running? I believe more of you would than fear you wouldn't. Blood is the steel. Showing up is the building. Go connect to the people you love, one true joint at a time, and let nobody tell you that what you've built with your own 2 hands isn't real.